Her first WTA title and has now captured the attention of the tennis world. Huge pressure. Alex Eala had a remarkable...
There are barely 1,100 to 2,000 Filipino residents living in Cincinnati. And yet, when Alex Eala walked out for practice at the Lindner Family Tennis Center this week, fans were pressed against the fencing before the gates had even opened. This is not the first time this has happened. It happened in Washington, D.C. It happened in Toronto, a city with more than 272,000 Filipino residents. Now it is happening again, in a city with a Filipino population 250 times smaller. By the end of this video, the scale of that gap will make a lot more sense, and so will the reason it does not need to make sense at all. Cincinnati typically plays a quiet role on the tennis calendar. Positioned as the last WTA 1000 event before the US Open, the tournament has long been treated as a tune-up, a place for players to sharpen their form before flushing meadows without the circus that follows a Grand Slam. This year, that description no longer applies. Lines formed outside the gates before opening hours. Fans crowded the practice courts for a glimpse of a player who has never competed at this tournament before. The most common explanation offered for this kind of turnout is the size of a local diaspora community. The idea that a big crowd requires a big population of expatriates living nearby to produce it. In Cincinnati, that explanation does not hold up, because the numbers are not there to support it. To understand why, it helps to look at the comparison directly. Toronto is home to more than 272,000 Filipino residents, according to figures cited by regional reporting. Cincinnati's Filipino population sits between 1,100 and 2,000, according to the same reporting. That is a population roughly 250 times smaller than Toronto's. And yet, the atmosphere inside the Lindner Family Tennis Center this week has been described in similar terms to what unfolded at SoBi Stadium in Toronto only days earlier. Sellout crowds, packed practice courts, and a level of anticipation that tournament organizers do not typically see outside marquee matchups. A population 250 times smaller should not be able to produce a comparable atmosphere. That contradiction is the central thread running through everything that follows. To trace where this wave began, the story has to start in Washington, D.C., 2 weeks before Cincinnati. Eala entered the Mubadala DC Open, a WTA 500 event, without a tour-level singles title to her name. She left with one. Her run to the final included wins over Naomi Osaka, Alina Svitolina, Leylah Fernandez, and Zheng Qinwen, setting up a championship match against top seed and world number 3 Jessica Pegula. The final itself stretched across 2 days because of rain. Pegula had taken the first set and was leading in the second when play was suspended. When the match resumed, Eala won the final 9 games in a row, closing it out 4-6, 6-4, 6-0. It marked the first WTA Tour singles title ever won by a Filipina player. In her press conference afterward, Eala reflected on the moment simply, winning a 500, it's insane. Pegula, for her part, acknowledged what she was up against on the other side of the net, noting of Eala's fans that it's not fun to play against. This was the first domino, the moment a tennis result turned into a story people wanted to follow, and in many cases, follow in person. 2 days later, that following showed up in Toronto for the National Bank Open. Eala received a first round bye off the back of her Washington title and opened her tournament in front of a sold-out crowd at SoBi Stadium, reported at roughly 10,000 fans. She defeated Alicia Parks 6-1, 4-6, 6-2, becoming the first Filipino player, male or female, to win a main draw match at the tournament. After the win, she said of the atmosphere, "I felt very at home." The run continued past Katie McNally and into the 4th round, where it ended against Belinda Bencic, 4-6, 0-6. Afterward, Eala posted a message to her fans on Instagram, referring to the city in Tagalog as Saya Pala Dito Sa Barangay Toronto, an expression that loosely translates to acknowledging how much fun the city turned out to be, using the word for a Filipino neighborhood community. Reporting on the tournament described the arena's energy as carrying the feel of a Filipino inter-neighborhood basketball league, transplanted into a tennis stadium. It was not simply a large crowd. It was a crowd behaving like it belonged to something local, in a city where, on paper, the numbers said it should. That kind of atmosphere did not go unnoticed by people who have spent decades around the sport. Rennie Stubbs, a former world number 1 doubles player and coach to Serena Williams, addressed it directly on her podcast following Eala's Toronto run. Describing the one-sided nature of the crowd during Eala's match against Bencic, Stubbs estimated that a large majority of spectators were supporting Eala rather than her opponent, and remarked that the environment was one that opposing players now have to be mentally prepared for. She also pointed to a moment after Eala's win over McNally, in which McNally reportedly told Eala, "Thank you for letting me be a part of this." On the broader implications for the sport, Stubbs said Eala, is going to bring so many young kids to the sport. She went further, comparing the atmosphere around Eala's matches to the energy that Serena Williams used to generate at the US Open in New York, calling it a level of crowd intensity that few active players outside of that comparison have ever experienced. Stubbs also acknowledged the friction that comes with a crowd this new to the sport, some spectators shouting midpoint, a habit more common in team sports than tennis, but framed it as a byproduct of enthusiasm rather than a problem to be managed. Coming from someone who has watched fan bases rise and fall across 3 decades in the sport, the comment functioned less as hype and more as a professional assessment. Whatever is happening around Eala right now appears to have staying power, not a short-lived streak tied to one good month. What makes the Cincinnati crowd particularly notable is that it is not being driven by a safe or predictable outcome. Eala enters the tournament at a career-best number 17 seed, her highest seeding at any WTA 1000 event, with a first-round bye. But she does not hold a winning record against either of her possible second-round opponents. Against Romania's Elena Gabriela Ruse, world number 77, Eala's record stood at 0-1, following a 3-set loss at the 2024 US Open qualifiers, 6-3, 1-6, 4-6. Against Poland's Magda Linette, world number 68, the head-to-head sat at 2-2. Eala had dropped their first 2 meetings, at the 2024 Abu Dhabi Open and the 2025 Nottingham Open, before winning their 2 most recent matches, at the ASB Classic and the 2026 Miami Open, where Linette had also notably defeated former world number 1 Iga Swiatek earlier this year. Ruse, meanwhile, arrived in form of her own, having rallied from a 4-0 second-set deficit to beat American Peyton Stearns in Toronto the week before. Linette and Ruse met each other first, in the opening round in Cincinnati, with Ruse winning 6-0, 6-3 to confirm herself as Eala's second-round opponent. None of this is the profile of a guaranteed advance. Fans filling the stands and the practice courts this week are not showing up because the outcome looks safe. They are showing up regardless of it. There is also a physical toll behind all of this that rarely makes it into the crowd shots. This marks Eala's first ever appearance at the Cincinnati Open. She withdrew from the tournament last year with a shoulder injury. Since then, she has played through one of the most demanding stretches of her career, the Washington title run, immediately followed by the Toronto campaign, during which she also tweaked her ankle in a 3-set win over McNally, later saying of the injury, "There's nothing wrong with it, and it was no serious problem." Speaking about her physical condition following the Toronto exit, Eala said that staying healthy remains on top of my priority all the time. Between tournaments, she described a plan built around basic recovery, a haircut, time with friends, and simply getting her mind off tennis before returning to the court for Cincinnati. The version of Eala drawing these crowds is not operating from a position of full freshness. She is doing it on a body that has played an extraordinarily high number of matches in a short window, by her own account one of the busiest schedules of any player inside the WTA's top 45. Part of why this fan base has attached itself so firmly to Eala traces back to where she started. She began playing tennis around age 4, coached for her first decade in the sport entirely by her grandfather, training on modest courts in the Philippines, described in various reporting as shell-surfaced or painted-over basketball courts, in a country where accessible tennis infrastructure remains limited. At age 13, following a title at the junior tournament Les Petits she received a scholarship to Spain's Rafa Nadal Academy, where she trained for roughly 5 years before turning professional. Reflecting on the surge of interest in tennis back home, Eala has pointed out that when she was younger, the courts were empty, nobody was playing. That contrast, a sport with almost no infrastructure or visible pathway, producing a player now filling stadiums thousands of miles from home, is part of what separates this fanbase from a typical expatriate following. It is not simply about representation. It is about an origin story that reads as improbable, which tends to generate a deeper, more personally invested form of support than a polished, well-funded path would. That distinction points to something larger about how fandom in tennis, and in sports generally, actually spreads. One model is geographically anchored, support that exists because a large population of a particular community happens to live in a particular city, inherited more than chosen, and largely capped by the size of that local population. Under that model, a market like Toronto, with its 272,000 Filipino residents, would always outperform a market like Cincinnati by a wide margin, simply because there are more potential ticket buyers within driving distance. The other model follows a person rather than a location. It is unconstrained by local demographics, capable of showing up in a city of 2 million or a city of 2,000 with roughly equal intensity, because the audience is not defined by where it lives but by who it is choosing to watch. Cincinnati is functioning as a real-time demonstration of that second model. A community of somewhere between 1,100 and 2,000 people should not, under the first model, be able to produce a sold-out practice court and a blocked-off arena entrance days before the tournament even reaches its second round. Under the second model, population size stops being the determining factor. The determining factor is simply whether Eala is on the schedule that week. That question becomes even more relevant looking ahead. The next stop after Cincinnati is New York, for the US Open, running from August 30th to September 13th. New York is home to one of the largest Filipino communities in the United States, a population that dwarfs both Toronto's and Cincinnati's by a wide margin. If a population of roughly 2,000 people in Cincinnati can produce sold-out practice sessions and a crowd loud enough to draw commentary from a 3-decade tour veteran, the open question is what happens when that same energy meets a city with a Filipino community large enough to fill a stadium several times over on its own. Cincinnati may not turn out to be the peak of this story. It may simply be the preview. What connects Washington, Toronto, and now Cincinnati is not a shared demographic. It is a single player who, across one summer, built a following that no longer depends on where she plays, only that she is playing. That shift, from a fan base tied to population counts to one that travels with a person regardless of the map, is what turned a modest pre-US Open tune-up event into the loudest story in tennis this week. There were barely 1,100 to 2,000 Filipino residents in Cincinnati this week. The crowd outside the practice courts looked like it belonged to a city with 250 times more.